Welcome to the Glastonbury Speakers Forum. It's an unusual Speakers Forum, obviously, because we're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic and we can't go to Glastonbury. Instead, I'm in the BBC, one of the offices here at the BBC. As you can see, there's no one here either, so don't feel you're missing out in the BBC headquarters. But I'm very proud today to be able to introduce Sir David King, the former government scientific advisor. So David has been holding the government's feet to the fire on the coronavirus crisis. He is also a passionate environmentalist and he is doing the same for the climate. He has all sorts of fascinating things to say. So without any more ado, I will hand over to him. He's a very, very interesting speaker. So please enjoy Sir David King.
Justin, thank you very much for that. I love a brief introduction, and that's what you've done. So I'm going to be talking about the paradigm shift that is required. So first of all, we have this global pandemic, which is right with us at the moment, being handled in a dreadful way, I have to say, by our government. I really cannot quite come to grips with that. But let me come to my slides, if I may. Here we come. And so that is just the title slide. If I could have the next slide. I'm going to start with this pandemic, but I'm taking you back now to 2006, when I was Chief Scientific Advisor. And I had reinvented the foresight program in government to be an in-depth process, and this was the biggest foresight program I ran on the detection and identification of infectious diseases. It was a major global program. I had something like 340 experts from around the world working on this program for about 2.5 years. Back to the last slide, please. Thank you. And in that period of time, we produced a report, which is still on the Government Office for Science's website, in which we said a pandemic will arise within the period to 2030, we said. And we described the nature of the pandemic. And for example, we said a virus will emerge from a wild animal. It will mutate and become a human-to-human virus. And because we have no defenses against the virus, it will be deadly and highly infectious, so it will spread rapidly. We did a calculation and we showed that if that virus emerged in some remote village in China or in Africa, within 3 months, it would be in every country of the world. And so what we said was, we all need to be prepared for a pandemic of this kind. The impact, if we're unprepared, would be devastating. I'm afraid, although the British government set in place its preparations, in 2012, those preparations began to be undone during the austerity period. And by 2016, the Department of Health had a survey of how prepared it was for a pandemic. And this survey was stamped top secret by the government and not allowed to get into the public domain. Now, it has been leaked into the public domain. And what that survey showed was that our hospitals were totally unprepared for a pandemic. Now, we weren't the only country in the world with hospitals that were unprepared, but the other countries in the world behaved exactly as the WHO recommended, beginning 1st of February when they put their recommendation out. The scientists in China had published in our journal, The Lancet, an extremely detailed paper on the nature of this epidemic, and they had even determined the structure of the virus. The net result is that by 24th of January, we had all the information needed to prepare ourselves for the pandemic. What happened in Greece, in New Zealand in particular, but in South Korea, in Taiwan, etc., countries began the preparation. The Greek government sent ships to China to bring back the equipment they needed to handle the epidemic. And so they never ran out of equipment. They put their country into lockdown before any other European country. The total number of deaths in Greece, it was 176. They're out of the pandemic now successfully. Our total number of deaths per day is still in the region of 100 or 2. And so, and at the peak, our deaths were around 1,100. So what all of the advice given by the scientific community was essentially ignored, at least in this country, the country where the advice stemmed from, was probably the least active in getting this epidemic in hand. Now, I believe the result is going to be that this virus is going to be very difficult to get rid of in this country. I think we're seeing the pressures on government to undo the lockdown process far too premature. We've got too many infectious people, newly infected every day still, and we don't have a proper test and trace system up and running. Our advice from Independent Sage is very clear. We shouldn't be lifting the lockdown now because it means that we run a very severe risk of running into a second wave, and then we'll all have to go into lockdown again. I'm now going to come to climate change, and the beginning of my story is in a sense much the same. The scientific community back in 1820 to 1898 had determined the real understanding of what happens if we keep burning fossil fuels and removing forests. 1898, a paper was published by a Swedish scientist predicting that if we continue doing this, the greenhouse gases would double in the atmosphere, and the result would be a temperature rise of about 5 degrees centigrade. 1898. The biggest computers in the world are now saying the temperature rise would be 5 plus or minus 2 degrees centigrade. We are now rapidly approaching double the pre-industrial level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now let me come to the second slide, which shows the European summer temperatures from 1900 to 2100. And in black, the average European summer temperatures, and in red, the model that was developed by the scientific community in our Met Office. Now, this is the model that predicts tomorrow's weather for the whole planet. It's an amazing piece of physics. I really admire every aspect of this model. We pull in data from every part of the world. We have our detectors on almost every commercial aircraft in the world, and all of that information comes back to the Met Office, goes into this enormous computer, and tells the world what the weather will be in their part of the world. So it's a complete all-world model. And we produced into that model greenhouse gases. Back in 2002, 2003, we had the most severe summer on record in Central Europe. So if you see the black curve, in 2003, there's an X marking the spot. This is the date when I got the Met Office to produce this figure for me. And I asked them to run the model back in time to see how well, without any change in parameters, their model could describe the temperature going back to 1900. And I think you'll agree that it's a pretty good description. And then I asked them to run it forward to 2100 to predict what the temperature rise would be. And what you see looks like noise, that's weather. So they reinitiated the program 6 weeks apart and ran it 3 times. And what I wanted to do was demonstrate weather looks like noise, and it is very noisy. They can only predict the weather out to a week ahead of time with any accuracy. 6 weeks, it's not accurate any longer. So the general trend in the red curves demonstrates what climate change is delivering to our world's climate system. That extreme weather event in 2003, the number of deaths in Central Europe was about 50,000. Not very different from the number of deaths we're currently experiencing from COVID-19 here. But if you then extrapolate forward, a line to the red curve forward to see when will the average Central European summer temperature be the same as that extremely hot summer in 2003? And the answer is 2045. So when we get to 2045, not only do we have a normal summer at that temperature, But it also means that when there's an extreme weather event, we have another excursion upwards. We may adapt ourselves slowly to the temperature rise indicated here, but will we be ready for extreme weather events? So what I wanted to emphasize now is climate change is not about the average, it's about what happens to extreme events when they sit on top of this rising average indicated by this curve. Now I'm going to try and keep my number of curves down to a minimum, but so that I don't lose my audience. So let me then say, so we start actions. The British government, faced with the sort of data I was producing for them, made the commitment to reduce our emissions 80% by 2050 and set up a climate change committee of parliament that would see to it that every government in future would follow the behavior that was set in motion back in that period of time. And I have to say, we're the only country in the world that had all-party agreement on this process, and we still have all-party agreement. You may be surprised, but it was Theresa May who changed the 80% to net zero by 2050, which is at least what is required. I'm going to say much more is required. But what that means is that we also need not only to reduce our emissions, we won't get to absolute zero, we have to have natural means to bring down the rate of greenhouse gas rise in this country so that we have net zero altogether. If I could have the next slide. We didn't have all of the technologies needed to deliver this. Here in Britain, we introduced feed-in tariffs to allow the utilities to introduce renewable energy systems. And I think you all know that in Britain, offshore wind has proved to be very, very successful. The cost of offshore wind is now lower than the cost of installing any other electricity system in the UK. And if you want to know why, it's because offshore, those wind turbines have extremely long blades. They're about approaching 100 meters long, and the longer the blade, the more efficient it is for producing electricity at a given wind level. So a good proportion of our wind is now coming from offshore wind, and we are just extending the program of that process. So this is successful. We are effectively no longer burning coal to create electricity, which is a big change for us. But it is not nearly enough. So basically in 2001, no, I don't mean 2001, I mean 2015, at the meeting of the COP in Paris, I had prior to that set my target on this program, Mission Innovation, in which we were saying what we need is to be spending $30 billion a year globally on all the new technologies to be advanced in a post-fossil fuel world, because it's not only electricity production, heat, for example, is a major challenge. We're still burning gas to do that. And so most of my friends in the British government were extremely surprised that this turned out to be successful. You will see David Cameron in that group of people standing under the banner Mission Innovation. He was the very last Prime Minister to join, although the idea came from Britain. And basically, the program has 22 countries plus the European Union supporting it. Those countries represent 85% of global expenditure of public money in research and development programs, and their commitment is very real, except for one, and that is the United States. President Trump has seriously withdrawn the funding from the United States, but the United States is still in the program. So this year we are spending not $30 billion, but $22 billion a year in this program. Now, all I want to say here is Britain has been in the lead in this whole program since 2002. When I moved back into government, working with Cameron and May, I was in the Foreign Office leading the negotiations, and Cameron created a budget for the negotiations, to assist in the negotiations, and the budget amounted to £9 billion. It wasn't a small budget at all, and no other country had a budget of this kind. £9 billion. We had 165 climate attaches in our embassies around the world, and every ambassador was focused on this issue. I'm saying all this, it's a surprise to most people because I was never allowed on radio and television to tell the British public what we were doing by Number 10. The communications people in Number 10 didn't want us to explain what we were doing, and the simple reason is they believed that the Daily Mail, the Sun and the Telegraph would run a campaign to stop all the funding and all of the actions, and they may be right, but it didn't seem like real leadership to me. So I move on to the next slide, which just demonstrates one aspect of a new technology. We all know that we can fly with airships. So this isn't a new technology, it's a new version of an airship. It's enormous, it's more than 100 meters long. It's about 130 meters long. It's about 60 meters wide. And it's got an aluminium shell around it. And inside there are air balloons, which you fill up with helium from helium cylinders on board. When you want to lift this thing, it's just lifted by releasing helium. If you want to bring it down, you pump the helium back into the cylinders and down it comes. This is for the transport of freight. So what you see underneath is a freight carrier. I think you might be able to see a vehicle. It's a very large vehicle in front of it. The scale of it is 12 stories high. So what I just want to say here is this is a real breakthrough technology. Now, how does it fly? You will see engines on the side of it, jet engines. Those engines are fueled by solar panels on the top of the airship. When it flies, I think we've got somebody with their system on speak.
It's someone called Green Futures.
Right. So when we fly at 30,000 feet. There's low air density. It can fly at about 340 kilometers an hour. It's not sluggish, and it carries an enormous amount of freight, about 150 tons of freight, and it costs no fossil fuel at all to run this airship. So that's just one example. We have a future, a low carbon energy future, low carbon future, but there are major challenges. Now I want to spell out the but part of my talk. The next slide shows you, and I'm afraid it is another graph, but what it shows is what's happening up in the Arctic. And I think the Arctic spells out a very real risk ahead of us, and it's ahead of us right now. So if I look at this slide, what it's saying is that back to 1980, there was a large amount of ice on the Arctic Sea, covering it right through into the polar summer. But that ice has been diminishing year on year, coming through. These measurements were made by a friend of mine, Peter Wadhams. Virtually his life's career is represented by these data points here. And so what you see is that now the Arctic Sea is exposed to sunlight, roughly 50% of it exposed to sunlight during the Arctic summer. And the result is, because the Arctic blue sea absorbs sunlight about 80 to 90%, whereas the ice reflects sunlight about 80 to 90%, the Arctic region, the Arctic Circle region as a whole, is now heating up at a rate of about 2.5 to 2.7 times the rate of the rest of the planet. Now, why is that worrying? If I could have the next slide, sitting in the middle of the Arctic Sea is, on the left-hand side, is Greenland. And when all the ice melts on Greenland, it means that global sea levels will rise by 7 meters. And of course, that means the maps of the world will dramatically change, and a good 80% of our cities are on coastlines and will no longer be livable. This is just looking at one melting event. This is also happening on the Himalayas. It's also happening at the South Pole. So what I'm actually saying is, where we are today at 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial level is already too high. What we are seeing is that Greenland ice is being lost, and again, the loss is following that speeding up process. The more ice we lose, the faster it goes. So we can't really predict when the ice will all have melted, but nevertheless, by the end of this century, as we move ahead, the sea levels will rise by between 2 to 4 meters by the end of this century. Well before that point, cities on coastlines like Calcutta, some countries like Bangladesh will be severely unlivable because of very frequent flooding. On the right-hand side, there's another worry, which is methane emissions. Methane is emitting from the methane hydrates, that's methane combined with ice, and there's enough of this stuff up in the North Pole region to cause a great deal of concern, because if all of that methane was emitted, global temperature rises would be about 12 degrees centigrade. Now, the worry is that we scientists don't really know how that methane emission is taking place. However, you may have seen the news items that up in the north of Russia, in Siberia, the temperature this summer, you will know that this is the middle of the polar summer, the temperature this summer has reached something like 32 to 35 degrees plus. Right, which means, of course, that the permafrost that the villages, railway lines, roads in that region are all sitting on is melting, and in particular, methane being released. What I'm showing you here is a region of northern Russia, the Yamal region, where villagers locally were reporting hearing loud explosions. And I believe they thought that the Russians were testing weapons up there. But the Academy of Sciences sent a group of scientists up to examine this, and this is what they found. Large circular craters. The craters, very beautiful, are about 50 meters diameter, about 70 meters deep, so they're very extensive. What you see on the right-hand picture is the picture, you see the shadow of the photographer on the other side of the crater. And on the other side at the rim, you see his colleagues standing there. Now, this is an explosive release of methane. The methane forms a bubble under the ice. And as this very large bubble gets to the pressure due to the ice above it, where the pressure is such that the ice above it can no longer hold the gas in, it releases like a champagne cork. And the result is that all of the ice is vaporized and all of the methane emerges as gas. Now, this is a very real problem, because if we have massive explosions, these are relatively small, although the estimate is that about 1,000 of these have happened since 2014. These are relatively small, but there's no reason why there shouldn't be a much bigger explosion, which would be a very, very big challenge to deal with. So what I'm saying is now that we need to do much, much more than was agreed in Paris. We still haven't achieved what was agreed in Paris, but nevertheless, that was not nearly enough. If we were to reach tomorrow net zero emissions instead of 2040 or 2035 tomorrow, the next 30 years of climate change is still with us. And these events I'm talking about here are in the pipeline, right? That beginning of the melting process at the poles is virtually irreversible unless we step in and take action. And so what I'm now pursuing is a program of climate repair. I've set up here in Cambridge an Institute for Climate Repair. If I could have the next slide. What that institute is set to achieve. And it's not as if we're going to do this whole bit of work. I'm setting up climate repair hubs in universities around the world. We hope to be the central hub where discussions and arguments will take place amongst the community, not just scientists, social scientists, NGOs. We're inviting all people to come and join us in these discussions. We need, of course, deep and rapid emissions reduction. That almost goes without saying. But we also need to create large greenhouse gas sinks. We need to remove greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere from the current 500 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent to less than 350 carbon dioxide equivalent going forward in time. Now, what does that mean in reality? If we did manage to get to near zero emissions by planting more forests, we can discuss how to achieve it, we would still have to remove greenhouse gases at scale. If, for example, we could discover techniques to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere at about 35 billion tons a year. I think it's achievable, but we need to develop all of the processes and see there are no negative effects. 35 billion tons a year, it would still take 30 years to get the planet back to a properly livable level. Therefore, we need a third element, which is, and this is the one that most people think looks impossible, and it may be very challenging, but I don't think it's impossible. We have to learn how to refreeze the poles, because that is the urgent challenge today. Now, I'm also working on a mission to create something to follow up on Mission Innovation, which is a global climate alliance of nations and states. So calling on countries to form an alliance to work on this mission, climate repair, country by country around the world. I don't believe we have the time to get 197 nations behind this, but I'm encouraged by what happened with Mission Innovation. Even 22 major countries, plus the European Union, would manage this problem. I'm aiming for initially, of course, the same 22 countries. They include China and India. Obviously, we need to be looking at the emerging economies as well as the Western economies. I would like to see major African countries come on board as well. So this is the program that we would like to see operating. And frankly, I don't think this is far-fetched. I don't think it's a luxury. I think it's a necessity. And at this point, I just give you my last slide, which is to remind everybody that actually we have a piece of good news, which is the population is now 8 billion. That's good news because that's a measure of how well-being has spread around the whole world. The problem is with that population and with the disparities of income, etc., around the world, we are, and the major driver of super consumerism, we cannot deliver all of this without being faced with these major new 21st century challenges. And therefore, what I'm calling for is a change in culture. We need to adopt from China the culture that they have now introduced of eco-civilization. That means managing ecosystems alongside managing human well-being. I believe we need to understand that we are a part of nature and not apart from nature. And I'm afraid over the last 1,000 years or so, we've lost sight of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Dave. That was very informative indeed, and has given us a lot of pause for thought. Can we unmute and show our appreciation to Sir Dave?
Thank you.
Thank you. you. Can we mute again?
Mute.
Okay. Right. I believe that we've got some people who'd like to ask questions, and I think Paula Hennessy would like to ask a question. Is Paula prepared?
Hello, Sir Dave. I just wanted to know, who is actually your science hero or heroine?
I think you need to unmute yourself, Sir
Okay,
Dave.
yeah, I'm unmuted. Sorry, Paula, I lost you in the middle of your sentence.
I wanted to know, who is your science hero or heroine?
Ah,
Person that you
so
most admire.
I would have to say Greta Thunberg comes very high on my list. This young girl, has raised the profile of the problem very, very significantly around the world. So it's so encouraging that a young person can stand up and get her voice heard, from sitting outside the Swedish Parliament all on her own. And then I think in terms of the scientific community, Jim Hansen in the United States, Jim, a NASA scientist, very severely criticized by several presidents, has been absolutely clear for many, many years about saying we cannot afford to increase greenhouse gas levels above 350 parts per million. Jim is spot on.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for your question. I don't think Justin Rowlatt is still in our audience, because I think he might have had a question. So I'm going to call on Ian B. Dunn.
Hello. We heard a few years ago that the British public are not interested in the advice of experts. Now, obviously, China, they may not have that problem because of the way their society works. Have you any long-term thoughts about that? What can we do to get people to actually listen to the message and take it properly on board?
Well, I have to say, I'm just really taken aback by that position that you've just described. But I believe, I mean, when I was in government as Chief Scientific Advisor, in accepting the post, I explained to the Prime Minister that I was an independent scientist. I cannot say anything to the public without saying it as it is, rather than as the politicians would like me to say it. My integrity is everything to me as a scientist. And I said as well, I don't want to be blocked from going on television and radio. I will give my advice into you and the cabinet, but the public needs to know what the advice is, whatever decisions the politicians make. So I'm recognizing as a science advisor that you need to put your advice into the government and let the politicians decide. But a critical part of this was to keep the public on side as well. And the public trust in science is, as you're saying, Ian, absolutely critical. And we've lost that. When I went back into government in after 2010, so I was now working in the Cameron government, the coalition government, the Foreign Secretary welcomed me saying, you're a talking head. We'll have you on radio and television explaining to the British people what we are doing on climate change. You know, we're doing all these wonderful things. I must have in the first week had 7 approaches from the media. Each approach had to go not to the Foreign Office communications team, but to the number 10 communications team, and every time it was turned down. And that carried on throughout my period in the negotiations. That's a complete cock-up, if I may say. You know, that's how to lose the trust of the public in the scientists. And we now have chief scientific advisors in every government department. That was what I did while I was chief scientific advisor, was introduce that. None of them are allowed onto the media. So how can the public have any trust in the science advisory system.
Yeah, yes, because we get on the, it's not so bad now, but it used to be on the news, you'd have the scientists, 100 scientists say one thing, one mad person says the opposite,
Right.
and they got equal airtime, and that's ridiculous.
Yes, exactly.
But it's not quite as bad now. The BBC have improved.
The BBC have improved, and Independent Sage that I set up is now getting a very substantial voice on the media. But let me explain why. The media would love to have the chief scientific advisor, the chief medical officer on. They're not allowed to go on. So they bring us from Independent Sage on. And that was the whole purpose of setting it up, was to say, let's put our stuff into the private government, into the public sector, and let's do it openly. We hold our meetings in the open, as you may know. So it's transparency, absolutely key.
And explaining, and there's hope, yeah.
Thank you very much. And I understand that Steve Wright is in the audience. I'm not quite sure, Steve Wright, whether you have a question for us.
You're on
I
mute.
didn't have a question prepared, but I'm fascinated. I was fascinated by your presentation. It was really insightful and deeply depressing at the same time. And I wondered that you do feel that you're being silenced by government, and we don't hear that often enough. We don't. You know, there's this, during COVID, we've had the chief scientific advisor, you know, almost on bulletin every day. I'm still really confused about what advice is and where you catch it, and I don't think anything's been clear, you know. And it's a shame that your knowledge and your insight is undermined by the politics and the news media of the day. It's quite depressing. So it's not a question, it's a comment. And thank you for your insights. A wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Steve. I see George with his hand up.
George, yes, okay. Shall we have George?
Hello. Yeah, I'm unmuted. So, yeah, we've been talking about this in
Can we see your face, George?
Can you? Right, I'll bring the microphone. Yeah, we were talking about this in the Green Lib Dems. Oh, where am I? On the microphone yesterday. And a professor who was also a parliamentary candidate said, oh, we can't put up the price of aeroplanes because they're so educational and then poor people won't be able to fly. We said, yeah, but the poor people in China and India and Africa, they want to go on holidays as well. And if everyone's allowed to go on holiday for 2 weeks, you know, the planet is. But the point is, we can't wait for the Green Party or the Liberal Party to take power. We've got to start now and really heavily. And one argument to use for the Conservatives, who are in power for 4 years, is that the first politician and scientist who talked about climate change was Margaret Thatcher. And,
Exactly.
but, you know, that's an argument to Tories. Your greatest hero was on this case, so follow her. I'm finished.
Thank you, George. I've got a question for Sir Dave. It's about festivals and other large sporting events. Obviously, all this is very sobering, but festivals have traditionally been in this country a great sort of rite of passage for our young people. But I see that there's so many obstacles in the way, in the means of sanitation and social distancing. Is this the end of festivals?
Gosh, I'm not here to depress everybody, Jean. I'm just going to say this. 97% of super spreading events around the world in this pandemic have occurred indoors, right? So the great outdoors is a much better place for people to gather. Now, at the same time, I'm not in favor of reducing the distance that we have to keep apart from each other from the 2 meters down to 1 meter. I think that is a very dangerous thing to do. Some of the data indicates the increased infection transfer rate is about 10 times by reducing that from 2 meters to 1 meter. But I really would encourage the formation of outdoor events. I would like to see, for example, primary school children going back to school in playgrounds, in parks. You know, I think the government ought to be thinking out of the box on this. There are many professional football and rugby fields that are not being used, stadiums that are available. We should be requisitioning these and making them available so people can meet their friends over a distance, but actually also participate in joint activities. Your question is very good. Now, I'm really worried about up restaurants and pubs from July the 4th. The number of infections in this country at the moment, people who have got the disease in one day, new people getting the disease in one day, is over 1,000. And that's a large number. If we were just going into lockdown, it would be because we had around 1,000 new infections a day. So coming out of lockdown when we've got a high level of infectivity is extraordinarily risky. But the second thing is that we don't have a test and trace system that's operative, up and running. The test and trace system introduced by the government, as we've already discussed, is a private sector operation, and that private sector has no knowledge of the health sector. So it's a de novo system, whereas we have a public health system that we are not utilizing for this process. If we can't test everyone who's become ill, if we can't trace all their contacts, if we can't check that they're in isolation, we're not going to get this epidemic out of the way. And my big fear is that it'll run through into the winter, and the winter months is when a pandemic of this kind takes off and we'll see a second wave. Can we go back to climate change? Pandemics are so depressing.
Well, thank you, Sir Dave. Actually, we've nearly come to the end of our time. I could take one more short question if there's anybody there who wants to raise their hand. Michael Dapp. Michael, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. Good morning, sir. The IEA published back in April that they anticipate COVID's probably reduced emissions in the first quarter of the year by 5%. So down to, and if that continues for the whole year, which it probably won't, we'll be back down at the end of the year to an 8% fossil fuel emissions load, equivalent to roughly the 2010 level, somewhere around 28, 30 gigatons of carbon, plus the other greenhouse gases, adding on another 10, 15 gigatons or so. There was also a report last few days, which I think originated from the IEA, saying that if there's a green bounce back, those emission levels will rise up to last year's 2019 levels by about 2030 and then level off. If there isn't a green bounce back, there's a dirty bounce back, they'll carry on rising and actually exceed the best case scenario of the pre-COVID level, which is going to put somewhere up the just purely fossil carbon up at the 38, 39 gigatons level by 2030, 2040. You've mentioned that with luck, you hoping to get 35 gigatons extracted. That seems to be, and that's not presumably going to start anytime soon. Are the figures as depressing as they look? Because none of them appear to indicate we're going anywhere near the Paris 15 target of dropping down, actually reducing levels. All we seem to be aiming for is keeping them at the same emissions level, which frankly seems it's a no-hoper for us all.
Michael, you're quite right. So in fact, it's a little worse than the IEA were predicting, and most of us are a bit confused by this, in the sense that if you look at the Mauna Loa data, this is the data point in Hawaii, which is the standard data for CO2 levels. The rise is just as fast in the last few months as it was in the previous months. So carbon dioxide levels are still rising. The really bad news is that methane levels are rising. The interesting thing there is not from oil and gas leakage, but from the agricultural sector, with a very big increase in meat demand, so increased livestock, and of course in rice demand. Both of those are big methane producers. So I think there is no good news coming out of the measurements at the moment. And what you say is correct. We are rapidly approaching emissions of 40 billion tons a year of greenhouse gases. Now, if we look at what the program I'm initiating now on removing greenhouse gases, I think we can see, we're only looking at technologies and techniques that can remove more than 1 billion tons a year. I think we can see the capability of removing 35 billion tons a year. Couldn't even remove what we're emitting today. And that's when we have it all up and running. You're quite right. We're not even close to that. I need to raise maybe, to run my centre, I need about 50 million pounds, but to run this program, we need about $60 billion a year. Now, it sounds like a large sum of money. It's not a large sum of money at all compared to the risks the whole planet is faced with. So I'm still hoping that this Global Climate Alliance is going to be the group that will come up with the funding.
Thank you, Sir Dave. I think that's all we've got time for. Can we all show our appreciation, please, for Sir Dave Flynn?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time with us.
Thank you. Goodbye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.